A young boy who lost his hearing was abandoned by his parents at the age of 5. 2 decades later, James, now grown, stumbles upon his parents in a park, homeless and pleading for help. Overwhelmed by the years of hurt and neglect, James faces them, demanding answers for the pain they inflicted on him. Can James find it in his heart to fully forgive them? And what will it take to mend the broken ties between them? Tune in to hear this powerful and emotional story. James was born on a sweltering summer afternoon in Tequila, a small town where the dusty streets seemed to melt under the weight of the relentless sun. Jennifer, exhausted but glowing, held her newborn son for the first time, feeling an indescribable love swell in her chest. Leo, her husband, stood by the bedside, grinning through his tired eyes, the weight of the moment heavy but full of joy. For them, James was more than a child. He was the continuation of their modest but deeply cherished lives. The early years were filled with the usual chaos of new parenthood, sleepless nights, scattered routines, and the relentless energy of a growing toddler. James was a curious boy, always watching the world with wide, thoughtful eyes. Jennifer would often sing to him while cradling him in her arms, her soft voice echoing through their small home. But she noticed something that unsettled her. James never turned towards her voice. No matter how close she was, no matter how loudly she sang, James remained unresponsive, his gaze fixed elsewhere. "Leo," Jennifer began one evening, her voice shaky as they sat at the small kitchen table, "I think something's wrong." Leo looked up from his meal, his brow furrowing in concern. "What do you mean?" "It's James. He doesn't react to sounds. He never turns when I call his name or when I sing to him." Jennifer's hands trembled as she clutched her fork, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. For a moment, Leo said nothing, trying to dismiss the worry that threatened to settle in his chest. "Maybe he's just distracted. Kids are like that," he offered, though even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. But Jennifer was not convinced. The following weeks passed in a blur of mounting fear as she tested her suspicions in small, subtle ways, clapping behind James, dropping objects to the floor to see if he'd react. He never did. Their home, once filled with the joyous babble of baby sounds, now felt eerily quiet, weighed down by the silence that surrounded their son. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, they made the decision to take James to the city for a medical consultation. The trip felt endless, the road stretching on under the sweltering heat, but Jennifer's heart raced with every mile. Leo held her hand tightly, sensing the storm of emotions that swirled within her, though he didn't say much. He wasn't one for words, especially when he didn't have answers. In the sterile coldness of the doctor's office, the truth came crashing down around them. The doctor's words were clinical, matter-of-fact, but they struck like a blow to the heart. James was deaf. He had been since birth. Jennifer felt her breath catch in her throat, her vision blurring as tears welled up. She had known something was wrong, but hearing it confirmed was a different kind of pain. The knowledge that James would never hear her voice, would never listen to the sounds of the world, settled deep inside her like a wound. "Is there nothing we can do?" Leo asked, his voice tight as he tried to remain strong for his wife. The doctor shook his head. "There are ways to help him communicate, but he will never hear in the way you or I do." Jennifer broke down, silent sobs shaking her body as she gripped Leo's hand. He pulled her close, holding her as though his embrace could shield them both from the reality that was now theirs. That night, back in their small home, the quiet was unbearable. Jennifer sat by James's crib, watching his peaceful face, wondering how she would explain the world to him when he could never hear its sounds. Leo stood at the window, staring out into the darkness, his mind racing with the same question. How could they raise their son in a world that, to him, would always be silent? "We'll figure it out," he said softly, though the words felt empty, more of a promise to himself than to Jennifer. But deep inside, both knew the road ahead would be harder than they ever imagined. James had changed their world, and now they would have to change for him. The kitchen was eerily silent, except for the clatter of Jennifer's hands as she set down the dishes. Routine had become mechanical, and the atmosphere between her and Leo had become heavy, almost suffocating. Mental depression and economic exhaustion make the way they communicate seem like they are blaming each other. "James has been quiet today." Jennifer broke the silence, her voice flat. She wasn't seeking conversation, just acknowledgement that their son, now 4, remained as distant as ever. Leo barely looked up from his seat at the dining table, his hand wrapped around a half-empty glass of whiskey, the drink of the evening. It had become his habit, one that Jennifer despised. He swirled the amber liquid in the glass, contemplating its emptiness. "He's always quiet, Jen," he muttered. The weight of his words pressed into the already tense air. "What do you expect me to say?" Jennifer's jaw tightened. It wasn't always this way. She remembered when they used to talk, really talk, about their hopes for James, about how they could help him learn, connect. But that was years ago, back when they still believed things might get better. "We've tried everything, Leo," Jennifer said, her voice wavering slightly, betraying the weariness she had carried for so long. "The speech therapy, the special classes, none of it works. He doesn't respond to us anymore." Leo drained the last of his wine, the glass hitting the table harder than he had intended. "You think I don't know that?" His voice was sharper now, defensive. "I'm here every day, just like you, watching him, trying to understand him. Our savings are gone too, on useless treatments that change nothing, Jennifer. Nothing." The bitterness in his voice stung more than Jennifer wanted to admit. She turned away from him, facing the sink, gripping the edge of the counter tightly. She could feel the tears forming but swallowed them back. Crying wouldn't help. It never did. For a long time neither of them spoke. It wasn't a new silence. It was the same silence that had filled their home for years. James was growing up, but without ever truly growing closer to them. The boy, once full of wonder, now drifted through life, his eyes vacant, his responses minimal. "I can't keep doing this," Leo finally said, his voice low but steady. The words were quiet, but they hit Jennifer like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" she asked, turning slowly to face him. She knew what he meant, but hearing it out loud felt like betrayal. He didn't meet her eyes. "I mean—" Leo paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. "Maybe it's time we think about sending him somewhere he can get the care we can't give him." Jennifer's breath caught in her throat. She had feared this moment, but now that it was here, it was worse than she imagined. "You mean a center?" The word sounded foreign, wrong, like it didn't belong in their family. "Yes," Leo said more firmly this time. "A place where he can be with others like him, where people are trained to take care of him. We can't do it, Jennifer. We've tried for 5 years, and we've failed." Failed. The word echoed in her mind. Failed. "We're his parents," she said, her voice trembling now. "We can't just give up on him like this." "I'm not giving up," Leo insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm trying to do what's best for him. He needs more than what we can offer, and I can't keep watching him drift further away from us every day." Jennifer felt the weight of his words, but the pain of them made it hard to breathe. "And what about us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What happens to us if we send him away?" Leo stood up from the table, leaving the empty glass behind. "We find a way to live again. We've been drowning for years, Jennifer. Maybe this is the only way we can survive." Jennifer watched as he walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy, like a man carrying a burden too great to bear. She remained standing at the sink, staring out the window into the darkness beyond. The truth was, they had both been drowning. But sending James away felt like losing a piece of herself that she wasn't sure she could survive without. The silence that followed wasn't new, but it felt final. The rain drummed softly on the roof, filling the small apartment with a low, constant hum. It was a quiet night. Too quiet, except for the heavy breaths of Leo and Jennifer sitting at the edge of their worn-out couch. Their gazes were locked on the small figure of James, who was busy playing with a toy truck on the floor, completely unaware of the weight of the decision that hung in the air. His innocent laughter cut through the tension in the room like a blade, making the silence between the couple all the more unbearable. "We can't do this anymore," Leo finally muttered, his voice barely audible over the rain. He rubbed his temples, his eyes dark with exhaustion. "We've tried everything, Jennifer. I don't see another way." Jennifer clenched her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles white from the pressure. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I know," she whispered, "but it feels like we're abandoning him. How can we live with ourselves?" Her words hit Leo like a punch to the chest, but he couldn't afford to show it. He had to stay strong for both of them. "The foster home will take good care of him. He'll have food, a roof over his head, maybe even a chance for a better life. What can we give him now? We're barely surviving ourselves." Jennifer nodded, but the guilt was already settling deep within her bones. She glanced at James, still playing happily, oblivious to the storm brewing in his parents' hearts. How could they explain to a 5-year-old that this would be their last night together? That tomorrow they would take him to a place he wouldn't understand, and they wouldn't come back for him? She couldn't bear the thought. The rain didn't let up as they drove towards the children's home, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. James sat in the back seat, his small face pressed against the window, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. He didn't ask where they were going. In his mind, it was just another nighttime drive with his parents, and that was enough for him. Jennifer kept glancing back at him, her heart breaking a little more with each mile that passed. Leo's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. He didn't say a word. What was there to say? They both knew that once they left, they couldn't turn back. This was their decision, no matter how much it tore them apart inside. When they arrived, an orphanage far away from where they lived. The building loomed ahead like a shadow in the rain. The entrance lights flickered dimly, casting long shadows across the wet pavement. James jumped out of the car, eager to explore, laughing as he splashed in puddles. He didn't notice how his mother's hands trembled when she buttoned his coat, or how his father's eyes seemed far away as he watched from the car. James, meanwhile, had spotted a swing set outside and ran toward it with glee, his small figure already disappearing into the rain-drenched yard. He was so sure they would be there when he returned. His trust, his love for them, made Jennifer's heart shatter. But they couldn't wait for him to come back. Without a word, Leo took Jennifer's hand, and they turned towards the door. Each step felt like a betrayal, like they were leaving a part of themselves behind in that dimly lit room. The rain washed over them as they hurried to the car, but nothing could cleanse the guilt that weighed them down. As they drove away, James was still on the swing. His laughter carried through the night. He waited, glancing at the door every few moments, expecting to see his parents return. But they never did. The first few nights at the foster home were the hardest for James. The unfamiliar faces, the cold, sterile rooms, and the absence of his parents gnawed at him. He would sit by the window watching the rain, waiting for the familiar car to pull up, for his mama and papa to come and take him home. But the days turned into weeks, and the hope in his little heart began to wane. He didn't understand why they had left him, why he was suddenly alone in a world without the comforting sound of their voices. He didn't cry, though. He couldn't find the tears. Instead, he withdrew, retreating into a silence that echoed the void they had left behind. James sat at the far corner of the playground, his small hands gripping the edges of a worn book he didn't quite know how to read. Around him, children ran in circles, laughter erupting as they played their games. The sound of their voices, though muted in his world, was something he could feel. Vibrations reverberating in the air, a reminder of how distant he was from them. He watched their mouths move, forming words that meant nothing to him. It was a language he couldn't grasp, and it isolated him more than anything else. He had tried to join in once, chasing after a ball as it rolled towards him, but when he caught it, a boy shoved him, mouthing something James couldn't decipher. He dropped the ball, confused, and they laughed. A sharp, biting laugh that even in its muted form cut through him. Days passed, and the playground became a place James learned to avoid. He found solace in small, quiet corners, far from the teasing. His inability to hear made him a target, but over time, James became sharp-eyed. He began to study the way they moved, the way their faces twisted before a taunt, the way their shoulders stiffened before a shove. It wasn't much, but it gave him a second to brace himself, to dodge the worst of it. Reading their lips became a survival tactic, and while it didn't grant him full understanding, it was enough to catch glimpses of their intentions. But then came the day Mike arrived. James noticed him first because he wasn't like the others. Mike walked slower, his eyes scanning the room the way James did. His movements were deliberate, careful, as though he too was trying to figure out where he fit in. But what struck James most was the boy's stillness. He didn't seem fazed by the chaos around him. Instead, he waited, eyes searching until they landed on James. Mike approached, standing quietly in front of him, and then, unexpectedly, began to sign. James blinked, watching as Mike's hands moved fluidly, forming shapes James had never seen before. He understood immediately. This was something different, something just for them. James's heart quickened. No one had ever spoken to him like this, not with hands, not with gestures that seemed full of purpose. "I'm Mike," the boy signed, fingers graceful in their movements. "I saw you sitting alone." James hesitated, his own hands awkward and unsure. He mimicked the shapes Mike had made, fumbling through his own name. "James," he signed, the letters clumsy but recognizable. Mike smiled, nodding as if to say, "That's it." Over the next few weeks, James found himself drawn to Mike, his quiet confidence and the way he made the world seem less hostile. Mike was patient, teaching him new signs every day, showing James how to communicate in a way that felt right. For the first time, James felt like he wasn't drowning in the noise he couldn't hear. Instead, he had a way to speak back. The other children still laughed at him. They still pushed, still mocked the way his hands moved through the air. But with Mike by his side, the world felt a little more manageable. Mike didn't seem to care about their teasing. He shrugged it off with an ease that James admired. And slowly, James began to do the same. Their friendship grew in the small moments they carved out together. Sitting under the shade of the big oak tree, they would talk in silence, hands moving between them in a conversation only they could understand. James learned to laugh again, a quiet sound, but a sound full of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Though the world outside their bubble was still sharp and unkind, within that space, James found something precious. Mike's presence gave him a sense of belonging, a feeling that he wasn't just the deaf boy who couldn't keep up. He was someone who could communicate, who could connect. And for the first time, in a long time, James felt like he was seen. The sharp smell of graphite lingered in the small room as James's hand moved gracefully across the paper. Each stroke brought a sense of release, a way to shape his emotions into something tangible. His drawings had become his refuge, a place where silence spoke louder than words. It was the only world that made sense to him now, especially after Mike's departure. Mike had been his anchor in the stormy sea of the orphanage. The two of them had shared whispered conversations late at night, dreaming about the families they wished would take them in. But the day came when Mike was adopted. James remembered standing in the corridor, watching as his friend left with a new family, his backpack swinging by his side. Mike had looked back once, a flicker of guilt in his eyes, but then he was gone. After that, the orphanage seemed even quieter. The kids played in the yard, but James sat alone by the window, sketching. Days blurred into one another, filled with the hum of children's voices that no longer reached him. His drawings, though, grew bolder, more intricate. Faces, emotions, and entire worlds emerged from his pencil. Art had become his only companion. As the years passed, James's skill sharpened, but so did his isolation. By the time he turned 18, he had transformed into a solitary figure, both in body and spirit. The void in his life had been filled with lines, shapes, and colors, yet it was a hollow satisfaction. Despite his talent, a question gnawed at him. Why had his parents abandoned him? It was a question without an answer, but it lingered like a shadow over everything he created. The orphanage, though home for so long, was never meant to last. James knew that his time there was coming to an end, and when the day finally arrived, it was bittersweet. He had few possessions to carry with him, a couple of sketchbooks and a handful of pencils. But the headmistress, a stern woman with a surprising soft spot for James's talent, had arranged something unexpected, a scholarship to an art school in a large city. A few of the teachers had pulled strings, recognizing that his potential could take him beyond the orphanage walls. And so, with little more than a suitcase and his art supplies, James left the place he had called home for years. The city was vast, overwhelming even, but it pulsed with life, a rhythm that James had never felt before. For the first time, he was surrounded by people who shared his passion for art. But despite this, a sense of detachment followed him wherever he went. He kept his distance from others, preferring the company of his canvas. It wasn't until he began volunteering at a local community center that James's world began to shift. There, he met a group of deaf children. At first, it was intimidating. He had no idea how to communicate with them. But art, as it had always been for him, became the bridge. Slowly, he taught them how to express their feelings through drawing and painting. Watching their faces light up as they discovered new ways to communicate reminded James of the solace he had found in his sketchbook as a child. For the first time in years, James felt a glimmer of purpose. Teaching the children didn't just fill his time, it filled a part of his soul that had been empty for so long. The community center became his second home, and he threw himself into his work. helping more and more children connect with their emotions through art. But despite these successes, the haunting memories of his abandonment remained. Even as he gained recognition for his teaching and his art, the old pain never truly faded. At night, after the last child had left the center, James often found himself staring at his own reflection in the glass, wondering what he had done to deserve being left behind. His life was comfortable now, more so than he had ever imagined it could be. He had friends, colleagues, and a steady stream of students who admired him. Yet, the more he achieved, the deeper the ache inside him grew. No amount of art, no number of children's smiles could erase the question that had always plagued him. Why was he not enough for his parents to stay? And so, despite everything, peace eluded James. His art had given him a voice, but it had not yet given him the answers he so desperately sought. James's eyes hardened, and he tried to use sign language to express himself. All these years, you just disappeared, without an explanation. Do you know what that did to me? Do you know? Leo swallowed. Although they didn't understand what James was saying, they understood that James was blaming them. His voice was weak. James, we didn't want to leave. We had no choice. Jennifer began to sob, her body shaking with regret. Leo reached out to take her hand, but James shook his head. I needed you. James continued using sign language, his voice choking, but he tried to hold back his tears. I was a child, and you weren't there. Leo looked up, his eyes red. We thought you would be better off without us. We were wrong, James. We were so wrong. The words hung in the air, and for a long moment no one spoke. James stood there, feeling the rage and pain churning inside him. But there was something else too, something unexpected. A small, fragile flicker of pity. He took a step back, his chest tightening. I deserve better, he thought, turning away from the broken figures before him. You both deserve it. As he walked away, their silent sobs followed him, a haunting echo of what might have been. James sat in the quiet apartment, staring at the dimly lit street outside. The conversation with his parents still echoed in his mind, each word weighing heavily on his chest. He had faced them after years of silence, and though he had prepared himself for the confrontation, nothing could have truly readied him for the flood of emotions. His heart was torn. Could he really forgive them? Could he live with himself if he didn't? Leo and Jennifer, his parents, had been broken people for as long as he could remember. Their promises had been empty, their love conditional, always tangled with their own failures. James had spent much of his life trying to distance himself from them, to escape the poverty, the shame, and the suffocating weight of their unmet expectations. But tonight had been different. He hadn't expected the sight of their faces, worn and fragile, to stir something deep inside him. For the first time, James saw the full extent of their suffering, and in his heart, the walls he had built over the years began to crumble. The silence in the room was deafening. His internal conflict gnawed at him. Could he turn his back on them, knowing what they were enduring? Or was there a way to help without fully forgiving, without betraying the boy who had once felt so abandoned by them? He ran his fingers through his hair and sighed, the weight of the decision nearly unbearable. There was no easy solution, no clear path forward, but deep down he knew that leaving them to suffer on the streets would haunt him forever. It wasn't about forgiveness, at least not yet. It was about doing what was right, even if the pain of the past still lingered. James stood up, the decision slowly forming in his mind. His steps were heavy as he walked out of the apartment, not entirely sure where he was heading, but knowing he had to do something. By the time he arrived at the shelter, his resolve had solidified. This was not about redemption for his parents. It was about compassion. And for him, this was the first step toward healing. He found Leo and Jennifer huddled together in the cold, their eyes red from tears. When they saw James approaching, a mix of hope and fear flickered across their faces. They stood up slowly, unsure of what his next move would be. James tries to express himself using both sign language and lip reading. "I can't forgive you," James said, his voice steady but strained. "Not yet, maybe not for a long time." He took a deep breath. "But I can't leave you like this." His words hung in the air, and for a moment no one spoke. Leo and Jennifer exchanged glances, their faces etched with disbelief. "I know what it feels like to be abandoned," James continued, his throat tightening. "And I won't do that to you. But understand this. This doesn't mean everything is okay between us." Jennifer's hands trembled as she reached out to touch his arm, her voice quivering. "James, thank you," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. Leo swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. We failed you. We know that. And we'll never be able to make up for the things we did. But—" James cut him off, shaking his head. "Stop. It's not about apologies anymore. It's about moving forward. About surviving." He took them to a homeless support organization where they could get the help they needed. "They'll help you here. You'll have a roof over your head, food to eat, and people who can guide you through this." Leo's eyes filled with a mix of shame and gratitude. "We don't deserve this," he muttered. James looked at him for a long moment. "Maybe not. But you're still my parents. And right now, that's enough." James stood before the door of the support center, his parents by his side. The building loomed quietly, almost imposing, its muted colors blending into the late afternoon sky. A soft breeze brushed against his face, but he hardly noticed it. At this moment, James felt suspended between two worlds. Behind him, the years of bitterness, of strained silence, and unresolved pain. Ahead of him, a future he couldn't quite define, one filled with the possibility of healing, but not without its own uncertainties. James turned away from them, the faint crunch of gravel beneath his shoes the only sound as he walked toward the setting sun. The horizon was painted with deep oranges and purples, and the wind picked up, tousling his hair. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't alone in facing it. There was something stirring in his chest, a tentative acceptance, though he couldn't quite call it forgiveness yet. It was something, though, a beginning. More than a year had passed when the knock came at his door. James wasn't expecting anyone and was still half asleep when he opened it. Standing on the threshold was Mike, an old friend James hadn't seen in years, his face breaking into a grin as soon as their eyes met. "James!" Mike's voice rang out with an enthusiasm that seemed to lift the very air between them. "Mike?" James blinked in disbelief, rubbing his eyes. "What are you doing here? I haven't seen you since—" I know," Mike interrupted, waving his hand. "It's been a long time, but I had to find you." James stepped back, motioning for Mike to come inside, still caught in the surprise of seeing his old friend again. Over the past year, James had become somewhat known in the community for his work with disabled children. He had thrown himself into charity programs, helping young kids with disabilities navigate life's challenges, perhaps in an effort to distract himself from his own. He didn't expect anyone from his past to resurface, but Mike, as they sat down, began to speak about his journey. "I found her. My mother," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. After all these years, I finally found her." James leaned forward, intrigued. "How was it?" smiled faintly. "It was hard. At first I didn't think I could forgive her for leaving me, for everything she put me through. But then I learned more, how she struggled, how she had no choice. It wasn't easy, but I forgave her." He paused, looking James in the eyes. "I needed to let go of that anger, James, and I think you do too." Mike's words lingered in the air long after he had left. That night, as James lay in bed, he felt the knot in his chest loosen just a little, had found peace by confronting the past, by understanding it. James realized it was time for him to do the same. The next morning, James decided to go to the nursing home to see his parents. As he approached, his father was waiting outside. The creases on his face were deeper, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world had finally bowed him. James's steps slowed, his heart sinking as his father looked up. There was no smile, no words of welcome, only sorrow etched into his features, the kind that spoke of unhealed wounds. "James," his father began, his voice thin and shaky. "Your mother. She's not well." He swallowed hard, as though the words were bitter on his tongue. "After you left, she hasn't been the same. She won't eat, won't drink. She's been waiting for you." The lump in James's throat tightened, making it difficult to speak. He had known this day might come, had braced himself for it, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to carry it. His father's words hung heavy in the air, but James didn't ask for more details. He simply nodded and followed his father inside. The room was small, dimly lit by the morning light that filtered weakly through a dusty window. His mother lay on a thin mattress, her body frail, her once vibrant skin now pale and drawn tight over her bones. The sight of her took his breath away. For a long moment, he just stood there, unable to move. Then, slowly, he knelt beside her, reaching for her hand. It felt cold, the warmth of life slowly fading from her fingers. He held it gently, his heart pounding in his chest. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for the first time in years, their eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition, just a flicker, but it was enough. "I'm here, Mama," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. "I'm here. I forgive you." Her lips trembled, and her eyes, though weak, filled with something that might have been peace. She squeezed his hand, the pressure barely there, but it sent a shock of emotion through him. In that moment, all the anger, all the resentment he had carried for so long melted away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of loss and love. The years they had wasted apart seemed irrelevant now. All that mattered was this fragile connection, the unspoken understanding between them. She didn't speak. Her body was too weak for words, but the look in her eyes was enough. James stayed by her side for hours, holding her hand, his father sitting quietly in the corner, his eyes red and tired. They sat in that room together, not saying much, just waiting. In the months that followed, James's mother's condition worsened. Tuberculosis, the doctors said. The disease had ravaged her body, and there was nothing they could do but make her comfortable. She was slipping away, slowly, her body giving in to years of hardship. But there were moments, small moments, where she smiled, where her eyes found his, and in those moments, James knew that despite everything she was content. The day she passed, James sat beside her bed, his hand still holding hers. Her breath had grown shallow, and with one final exhale, she was gone. It was peaceful, the way she left, like a leaf finally letting go of the branch after holding on through the storm. And for the first time in a long time, James felt something lift inside him. After the funeral, there was a quiet resolve in him. He took his father home, to the small apartment he had managed to hold on to. They didn't speak much about the past, about the years of separation or the arguments that had driven them apart. Instead, they focused on the present, on the simple things, meals together, the comfort of shared silence, the healing that came in quiet, unremarkable moments. And as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, James began to understand that forgiveness wasn't about the grand gestures. It was about the small things, the daily acts of love that slowly mended the wounds of the past. The next morning, James returned to the shelter where he had last seen his parents. His father was waiting in the same spot, but his mother was nowhere to be found. His father looked older, more fragile, and as James approached, the sorrow in his eyes told James everything he needed to know. "James," his father began, his voice shaking, "your mother. She's not well. After you left, she hasn't been the same. She won't eat, won't drink. She's been waiting for you." A lump formed in James's throat. Without saying a word, he followed his father inside. His mother lay in a small room, her body frail, her breaths shallow. For the first time in years, James knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment there was a flicker of recognition. "I'm here, Mama," he whispered. "I forgive you." Her hand squeezed his gently before. Few months later, James's mother died of tuberculosis after years of being homeless. But it can be said that the last days of her life were the happiest time in Jennifer's life when she met her son again and received his forgiveness. After the funeral, James took his father home with him, determined to care for him in his final years, just as he had been cared for as a child. Wow, what an emotional journey we've just experienced together. James's story reminds us that forgiveness isn't easy, but it's the key to healing, even when it comes late. Seeing him reconcile with his parents and find peace despite all the pain really shows the strength of the human spirit. If you've ever struggled with forgiveness, remember that it's never too late to take that first step. We don't always get a perfect ending, but we can find peace in the moments we create along the way. If this story touched you, be sure to leave a comment below. What would you have done in James's shoes? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the heart of real human experiences. And, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.